Some nights aren't meant for sleeping, they're meant for remembering. The weight of his hands in your hair, the silk you wore beneath a coat no one else saw, the sound of your own diary being read aloud in his bed. Tonight, I'll whisper 3 stories. Each one begins with quiet and ends somewhere between breath and skin. So settle in, let the dark hold you, and let me begin. It started with rain, not the polite kind that taps gently on windows like it's asking to come in. No, this was the kind that flattens fields, spills secrets into the street, and forces strangers into shared doorways. We were hardly strangers though, not then, not quite. We had arrived in Honfleur late that afternoon, the 2 of us, and 2 separate rooms that turned out to be one. There'd been a booking mistake, of course. That's what the innkeeper insisted with a shrug, his moustache twitching like it held the final word. Only 1 room left, monsieur, and a storm tonight. Perhaps it's destiny. I still remember the way you glanced at me in that moment. One brow raised, a soft smirk on your lips, like you were waiting to see how I'd react before deciding if it would be amusing. And maybe it was. Maybe it always had been, between us. The room was small, wood-beamed, sloped ceiling, the kind that traps heat and secrets. There was 1 bed, a wide one, but still. We agreed, quickly, without saying much, we'd sleep on opposite sides, just for the night. But then came the walk in the rain. You had insisted we explore the harbor. It looks more beautiful in bad weather, you'd said. And so we did. Coats soaked, boots muddy, hands cold, laughter louder than the thunder rolling in. By the time we returned, my shirt clung to me and your hair had turned into dark rivers trailing down your back. And that's how it began. You were in the bathroom when I realized I couldn't stop watching the door. I heard the splash of water, the gentle thud of boots being towed off, the rustle of wet clothes, the soft curse you always let slip when your necklace clasp tangled. I sat on the edge of the bed, the window cracked just enough to let in the smell of wet stone and sea salt. And then you stepped out, wrapped in nothing but a towel and that same necklace you hadn't managed to remove. Your hair hung in thick, damp ropes, droplets skimming the curve of your shoulder. You looked tired and entirely too beautiful. You didn't notice me watching, not at first. You were too busy searching for something in your bag. A hairbrush, I think. Or maybe the silk tie you used on your hair. I never asked. Then you caught me staring. You didn't smile. You didn't blush. You simply said, "Could you help me?" I hesitated, a beat too long. You sat on the bed, back to me, the towel riding low across your spine. "This tie," you said softly, handing it over your shoulder. "My arms are tired." I took the tie from your fingers, my own trembling slightly. You tilted your head forward, exposing the nape of your neck. Her skin smelled of rain and lavender soap. I remember that clearly. and the way her breath caught just once when my fingers brushed her skin. I gathered the damp weight of her hair, careful not to pull too hard. My hands worked slowly, more aware of her breath than the tie itself. "You're doing it wrong," you whispered, but didn't move. I smiled. Maybe on purpose. You chuckled quietly. "Figures." When the knot was done, loose, crooked, imperfect, I didn't let go right away. Your head leaned slightly back, not into me, but not away either. And then, still without turning, you said, "Thank you," as if I'd done something far more intimate than braid wet hair, as if I'd been invited to cross a line and chosen, just for now, not to. That night, we didn't sleep immediately. The storm outside blurred everything into a hush, except the sound of breath and thoughts we didn't speak. You stayed on your side. I stayed on mine. But I remember, before the dark fully swallowed the room, your voice in the near silence. "Tomorrow," you said, "I'll do your hair." I laughed into the pillow. "It's barely long enough." You turned over. I felt the shift in the mattress more than saw you. "Then I'll find something else to tie." And just like that, I knew I wouldn't sleep at all. I woke before the light. The room was dark, but not silent. The storm had eased into something steadier, softer. Rain tapped against the old window pane like fingers drumming thoughtfully. You were still sleeping, or at least pretending to. I could hear the quiet rhythm of your breath, steady and close, and I wondered how many inches now separated us on the bed. Fewer than we promised, fewer than we intended. I lay still, staring at the ceiling beams, wondering what came next. You stirred just before dawn. I knew you were awake not from sound, but from silence. That specific kind, when someone nearby is thinking too loudly. We didn't speak. Instead, I rose quietly and padded to the small vanity by the window. The glass there was streaked with condensation, blurred by time and weather. My reflection looked unfamiliar, softer, perhaps, or simply more honest. You sat up, eventually, with the sheet around your waist and hair still damp where the knot had loosened overnight. You watched me. I knew because I could feel it. Then your voice, low and groggy. "Do you always wake this early?" "Only when I've been thinking all night." You hummed, a sound that vibrated low in your throat. Dangerous habit. I turned slightly, catching your eyes in the mirror. You said you'd tie my hair today. You smiled, not wide, not certain, but it reached your eyes. Is that your way of asking for more? Maybe. You slid out of bed, bare feet against the wood, and walked toward me. The towel from last night had been discarded sometime between dreams and indecision. Now you stood behind me in the faint gray morning light, fingers grazing my shoulders before trailing to the back of my neck. "I don't think I've ever tied a man's hair," you whispered, amusement curling around the words. It's barely long enough, I reminded you again, half laughing. Then I'll pretend. And you did. You gathered what little there was, your fingers warm against my scalp, moving with a gentleness that felt deliberate. Your breath hovered behind my ear, and I didn't dare move, not out of fear, but out of reverence. This imaginary ponytail, you said, is going to look ridiculous. I closed my eyes. Good. A pause. Then your voice, quiet and closer. We weren't supposed to share a room. No, I admitted. Another pause. But I don't regret it. The rain outside grew louder again, as if the clouds themselves had opinions. You stepped back, not far, and walked toward the window, peering out into the silvery morning. I've always wondered what it would be like, you said after a long silence. What would be like? You turned, leaned against the sill, arms crossed over your chest. Not defensively, just thoughtfully. Waking up next to someone and not wanting to leave. I looked at you then, really looked. At the curve of your collarbone, the mess of your hair, the vulnerability you hadn't meant to let show. I don't think I want to leave either, I said softly. You didn't smile. Not exactly. But you walked back toward me, slowly. The space between us narrowed like a sentence waiting to be finished. And just before you reached me, your fingers brushed my wrist, then closed around it, gentle but certain. This isn't just the rain talking, you asked. No, I said, but even if it was, maybe the rain knows something we don't. You laughed then, softly, and rested your forehead against mine. For a moment, that was enough. But we both knew where this was going. Not because we planned it, not because the room demanded it, but because something in the way I held your gaze and something in the way you didn't look away said we were already past the point of pretending this didn't mean something. Still, we waited, not for permission, but for quiet. And when it came, you whispered, "You still smell like last night's storm." And you, I said, still haven't removed that necklace. You leaned back just slightly, reached behind your neck, and unclasped it. The chain fell into my hand like an offering. "Now it's your turn," you murmured. I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't need to. The necklace sat on the windowsill now, glinting faintly under the soft glow of the morning. Its absence from your throat was strangely loud, as if something private had been unhooked from both your body and the boundary we had quietly honored until now. We didn't dress, not right away. Instead, we let the quiet fill in the edges, a kind of wordless agreement neither of us dared to break. You were sitting on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on your knees, hair in soft disarray. And I was still standing by the vanity, unsure whether I felt too far away or far too close. You turned your head slightly and looked at me. "I can't tell if this is the beginning or the end of something," you said, and the weight of your voice was heavier than before. It feels like the middle, I said, half joking. You didn't laugh, but you didn't look away either. I crossed the room, slowly, deliberately, and knelt before you, not out of theatrics, but because my legs gave in to the gravity between us. My hands reached up toward your shoulders, resting lightly as if to ask, "Is this okay?" You didn't answer in words. You leaned forward and pressed your forehead to mine again, and we stayed there for a breath, then another. "You're different when you're quiet," you said. "How?" "Like you've stopped hiding behind your cleverness." "I wasn't hiding," I said. You looked at me, directly, piercingly, and said nothing. Okay, maybe I was, and maybe I wasn't the only one. Your hand reached up to touch my face, knuckles grazing the curve of my jaw, thumb brushing just beneath my lower lip. It wasn't lustful, not yet. It was something gentler, rarer, something that almost frightened me. And then you kissed me. There was no hesitation in it, no fumbling or awkward gasp, just the slow realization that this moment, fragile and quiet and undeserved, was about to become ours. You pulled me into your lap, fingers tangled in the hair you had tied not so long ago. It had come undone again, naturally. Of course it had. Your hands traveled slowly, reverently. My skin responded in kind, every breath shallow and heavy, every inch of contact deliberate. You knew what you were doing, and more terrifying than that, so did I. Somewhere between the first kiss and the second, the question of should we disappeared entirely. It didn't matter. It had already been decided in the way I had said goodnight too softly last evening, and the way you had offered me the dry side of the bed without speaking. We made love the way one writes a letter they never intend to send, honestly, longingly, and with the quiet desperation of someone who knows the morning will ask for more than either of us are ready to give. Your hands on my body were a kind of language, and I read every syllable. When I touched you in return, I wanted it to feel like a promise, even if it was one I wasn't brave enough to say aloud. When it ended, or at least slowed into the kind of stillness only lovers know, we stayed tangled together on the narrow bed, breathless, unspeaking, and impossibly awake. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Inside, we were a mess of limbs and skin and unsaid truths. You traced circles on my chest with your fingertip and said, "Now, your hair's a disaster." I laughed softly. "Then you'll have to tie it again." You kissed my shoulder. "I think I will." We didn't sleep, not really, just drifted in and out of consciousness like sailors on uncertain tides. It wasn't until you whispered, "I have to be somewhere," that reality finally returned, uninvited. You sat up, slowly, regretfully. Your hand brushed mine as you reached for your shirt, and I resisted the urge to pull you back down beside me. "Do I get to see you again?" I asked. My voice was barely above a whisper. You looked back over your shoulder, eyes searching mine, as if the answer had to be excavated from deep within you. "You already saw more than I meant to show," you said. That should count for something. I nodded, though it hurt. It always does. I woke to the scent of him, still lingering on the pillow beside me. Cedar and salt, with a trace of something warmer, more human, like heat and longing. The room was quiet now, emptied of the energy that had pulsed like a current through it the night before. And he was gone. There was a note. It wasn't dramatic. No last confession or romantic flourish. Just a single folded piece of stationery, resting beneath the brass hair tie he had used to bind my hair, once in jest, once in tenderness, and perhaps unknowingly as a way to remember. I unfolded the page. I would have stayed if I knew how to leave quietly. His handwriting was tight, a little slanted, but careful, like someone who had once tried to write with a ruler. I held the note for a long time, then folded it back and placed it in the drawer of the nightstand, next to the brass tie. And then I breathed, not because I wanted to, but because it was what remained to do. It wasn't the kind of heartbreak that shatters. It was the kind that seeps in slowly, like rain through old windows. Quiet, lingering. I made my coffee slowly that morning, wrapped in the same robe he had tugged gently from my shoulder just hours earlier. Everything tasted like him. And then I went about my day. Because that's what we do. Even after the intimacy, even after the honesty, even after the morning comes. 2 weeks passed, no message, no call, just the ache of a memory that felt both deeply mine and wholly unreal. I wasn't angry, not really, just suspended. Then one afternoon, just as the sky began to bleed into that muted rose hue that only mid-autumn knows, I returned home to find a package on my doorstep. No name, just handwriting I now knew too well. Inside was a book, old, leather-bound, the spine cracked from use. Inside the front cover was a small, pressed bundle of rosemary, brittle and fragrant, as if carrying memory between its dried green veins. And beneath it, a card. You once said rosemary was for remembrance, but I think it's also for return. My breath caught in my throat. I sank into the armchair, card clutched in my fingers like something living. I didn't respond, not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to be sure that he wasn't just good at entrances, that he'd learned how to stay. 1 month later, I found him in the same bookstore where we'd first argued, quietly, passionately, about poetry and second-hand editions. He was leaning against the travel section, reading something about lighthouses. He hadn't seen me yet. I stood there, watching him, and I knew. He turned slowly, as if sensing the weight of a gaze meant just for him. His smile wasn't wide, but it was true. You came back, I said. I didn't know how not to. That's when I walked toward him, slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of knowing exactly what I wanted, what I needed. When I reached him, he didn't ask if I was still angry. or hurt or confused. He just reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in linen. I took it from his hands, unwrapped it. It was my hair tie, the same one he'd used that night. I kept it, he said, because I didn't want it to be just one night. My fingers curled around it instinctively, and in that moment, I felt every knot he had carefully undone, and every one he might still be willing to tie. "Would you?" I began. He didn't wait for me to finish. He stepped closer, reached up gently, and with quiet reverence, gathered my hair once again, lifting it off my neck, running his fingers through the familiar waves and securing it back where it had once rested. There was something ceremonial about it, a ritual almost. The world hushed. When he finished, he let his hands drop, then took mine in his. "Still too tight?" he asked, smiling. "Just right," I said. And I meant it. We didn't go back to his place, or mine. Not that day. We walked the long way through the city instead, our shadows stretching beside each other under the golden blur of street lamps. We didn't rush. There was no need. The story we had begun that night, the one wrapped in a glance, a shared bed, a hair tie, and all the quiet things we didn't say, wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Sometimes, intimacy doesn't begin when clothes fall to the floor. Sometimes it begins when someone offers to tie your hair and does it like they've waited their whole life to learn how. It was the kind of winter that hung over Vienna like a sigh. The rooftops wore their snow like lace, delicate, unbothered by time, while the cobblestone alleys echoed only the hush of boots and the soft rustle of coats being drawn tighter. I remember the chill, not for its cruelty, but for how it asked to be noticed. Like him. He arrived on a Monday, I think, or maybe it was Tuesday, but the coat he wore, dark, heavy wool, lined with velvet at the collar, was unforgettable. I saw it before I saw his eyes. That coat moved like he belonged to it more than to himself, and when he hung it beside mine on the brass hook in the foyer of Frau Velton's boarding house, I remember wondering what it would be like to disappear beneath it. We were only meant to share a roof, not a story. The house was old and a little tired, much like the piano in the corner that no one played, but that still seemed to remember every note. I lived upstairs, room 3. He was across the hall, in 4. We passed one another like the wind passes through curtains, soft, unmeasured, a little curious. He didn't speak much the first week, just nodded. Occasionally, he'd hold the door a heartbeat longer than necessary. That was enough to keep me up at night, and then came the evening of the concert. It was cold enough that breath turned to lace mid-air. I wore a simple black dress and the long beige overcoat that had belonged to my mother. Underneath, well, that was the night I first considered what it might feel like to be looked at slowly, not all at once. Beneath the coat, I wore something silk, pale, nearly translucent, more for myself than for anyone else. But when I passed him on the stairs, and he looked, really looked, I remember the way my spine straightened beneath the layers, like a secret trying not to tremble. The concert was lovely, I'm told. I don't remember much, just that I sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his sleeve through my own, and that once, only once, our hands touched on the armrest. Not a brush, a stillness, a question neither of us answered. When we walked back, Vienna felt quieter than usual. The snow had deepened, and the night curled around us like something listening. We didn't speak, but our shadows walked too close, tangled in the glow of gaslight. Back at the boarding house, I turned to say good night, but he stopped at my door. "You wore that for the music?" he asked. I should have said yes. I should have said something clever, something distant, but my pulse betrayed me. I simply met his gaze and said, "I wore it because it made me feel like something worth waiting for." He didn't kiss me, not then. He didn't even touch my hand. He just smiled, quiet, unreadable, and stepped back. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on my bed with the silk still clinging to my skin, and the cold of the room never touched me. Not really. The next morning, there was a note tucked under my door. It read only, "Meet me in the library, midnight." The handwriting was steady, deliberate, like someone afraid of too much urgency. I held the paper to my lips, though it smelled only of ink and dust. The rest of the day was a blur. I played the piano when no one listened. I brewed tea just to watch it steam. I stood at the mirror too long, trying to decide what to wear beneath my overcoat. I chose the same silk. Midnight came slowly. The house exhaled its last footsteps by 10. By 11, even the pipes had gone quiet. I waited until the clock struck 12 before moving barefoot across the hall, careful not to breathe too loudly. The library was at the end of the corridor, behind a door that creaked apologetically. Inside, the fire had been lit. It flickered like it was trying to remember something. And he was there. He didn't rise when I entered, just looked up from the armchair where he sat, a glass of something amber in his hand, his coat draped over the back of another chair. I stood near the fire. Neither of us spoke. Then, slowly, he reached for the coat and handed it to me. "I think you'd feel safe in this," he said. I took it, slid it over my shoulders. It was warm, smelled faintly of tobacco and pine, and something I couldn't name. I sat across from him, the coat enveloping my frame like a shelter that had been waiting for me. "What's this?" I asked, gesturing at the fire, the hour, the silence. "A memory we might need someday," he replied. We didn't touch. Not yet. But something passed between us, a kind of permission, like music beginning in a room where no one was supposed to sing. I remember every second of that silence, and what I wore beneath his overcoat. That coat became our first secret. In the days that followed, he never mentioned the library, never asked for his coat back. I wore it once more, curled into the window seat of my room, watching the snow fall against the amber lamps on Kärntner Strasse. It was a slow snowfall, the kind that felt like a lullaby written only for old cities and quiet confessions. Wrapped in his coat, I allowed myself to think about how his hands had folded it, how they might fold around something else, my shoulders, my breath, the silk still hidden beneath layers. He didn't knock the next night or the one after, but every evening I found something different outside my door. A small envelope, unsealed, a black and white photograph of a bridge in winter, a pressed violet from the garden below, a matchbox from a jazz bar neither of us had ever spoken of. Each thing a whisper, each thing not a question, but an invitation. It wasn't until the 5th day that I left something back. My note was shorter than his. Try room 3 instead, 11:45. I left my door unlatched. The moments before he came were the longest of my life. I had bathed slowly, tracing the warmth of water as if it were his hands. The silk I wore beneath my robe was darker this time, wine-colored, almost too thin to be proper. I stood by the mirror and didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. She looked ready to be remembered. When I heard the soft push of the door, I didn't turn. I kept my gaze fixed on the window, where the snow was falling again, gentler now. He paused at the threshold. I could feel it. The quiet in the air shifted. Then his voice, low, hesitant, reverent. You left it unbuttoned. I turned. My robe was loose, tied only at the waist. Beneath it, the silk clung like dusk to the contours of my skin. I could see his breath catch, not in sound, but in the way his shoulders froze, like he had stumbled into something sacred. I thought we weren't touching, he said, almost with a smile. I didn't invite you to touch, I replied, just to see. He took a step closer, then another. At 3 paces away, he stopped. Our silence stretched long, as if we were holding opposite ends of a thread neither of us dared pull. What are we doing? He asked. I don't know, I whispered, but it feels like something we'll regret not doing. He nodded, still didn't move. I walked to him instead, slowly, deliberately. The hardwood was cold beneath my bare feet, but my skin felt like summer beneath the silk. I stopped in front of him and pressed my palms lightly to his chest. I want you, I said, to remember this. Whatever happens, remember the night I wasn't afraid to be seen. He touched my arm then, barely, like a sigh made flesh. His fingers traced the silk at my shoulder, then let go. I will, he said. I already do. He didn't stay. That was the beauty of it. He walked back to his room without a kiss, without a glance behind him. And I didn't stop him. There are moments that belong not to desire, but to restraint, to the kind of ache that doesn't demand, but waits. That night, I slept beneath the weight of his coat, with the wine-colored silk tangled around my thighs, and the window still cracked open to the snow. The next day, everything changed. Frau Velton announced that the boiler had failed. Most of the tenants began making arrangements to move, at least temporarily. The house felt colder, emptier. The air held the kind of silence that doesn't come from absence, but from endings that arrive before they're spoken aloud. I found him later in the hallway, packing a leather satchel. "Leaving?" I asked. "Just for a few days. To Graz. There's a client there who refuses to wait." And then he looked up at me. "I don't know." He took a breath, reached into the satchel, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not a letter, a sketch. Charcoal on cream. It was me, standing by the window, wearing his coat. "You drew this?" I asked. "I watched," he said softly. "That night in the library. You didn't know, but I wanted to remember the way you looked when you thought you were alone." I held the drawing as though it might bruise. "I want to see you again," he added. "But if I don't, then remember," I finished. He left at dusk. I stood at the foyer window and watched his figure disappear into the falling snow, his coat now replaced by something thinner, more practical. He didn't look up, didn't wave, and still, I felt seen. For the next week, I wore his coat every night, not outside, only in my room, over the silk, over the nothingness. Each time I waited, but he didn't come back. Not yet. There's a certain kind of stillness in old houses when one voice goes missing. The wallpaper seems to listen harder. The floorboards groan longer, and the hallways, those narrow arteries of gossip, forget how to echo. The morning after he left, room 6 felt like a page torn from the rest of the book. I found myself walking past it often, even though I had no reason to. My steps slowed near his door as if some part of me was still waiting for it to open. Sometimes, I left my own door slightly ajar, a habit I couldn't break. As if the night he returned, I might not hear him knock, but I'd feel the air shift. On the 4th day, Frau Velton delivered a package to my room. It was wrapped in parchment, sealed with a dark ribbon, no note. Inside, his coat. It was heavier than I remembered, holding the scent of him more deeply now, like travel, wood smoke, and something faintly citrus. Beneath it, hidden in the inner pocket, was a train stub. Vienna to Graz, one way, no return. I should have taken it as a goodbye. Instead, I wore the coat again. But this time, I wore nothing beneath it. Not silk, not memory, just skin and something unspeakable, a longing that refused to clothe itself in hope. I walked to the window like that, the coat unbuttoned halfway, snowlight brushing the top of my thighs. In the mirror's edge, I caught a glimpse of myself, hair loose, eyes unreadable, and the coat falling off one shoulder like I'd been undressed by absence. I wrote a letter that night, not to send, just to feel his name again on paper. "You left too softly. I wish I hadn't blinked." I tore it up, A week passed, then 10 days. Then, one morning, his scent was gone from the coat, and something inside me cracked. It was subtle, a fine hairline fracture of the soul. Not grief, exactly. More like the realization that I had been holding my breath for far too long. I began sleeping without the coat. Instead, I pulled the robe from that night out of the drawer, the one that had only ever been tied loosely. I wore it to bed, leaving the front open to the night air. A small defiance, a quiet rebellion against the cold he left behind. On the 11th day, I went down to the postbox in the front hall for the first time since he'd left. Inside, nothing, except, just behind the other boxes, tucked between two slats of the wooden frame, something white. I reached in, heart racing. It was a folded sketch wrapped around a single key. The sketch. Me again, but not at the window. This time, I was seated, legs folded beneath me, the overcoat slipping off my shoulder, eyes closed, lips parted, not in speech, but in the moment just before surrender. It was a memory he shouldn't have seen, and yet he had captured it. The key was brass, worn. Attached to it was a torn piece of linen, frayed at the edges, with one word written in ink. Soon. That night, I didn't sleep. I lit 3 candles and sat on the floor, sketch in one hand, key in the other, wondering what door it would open and when. There were no new tenants, no new voices in the house, no sound from room 6. But in the silence, something began to bloom again. Not hope, not exactly, more like hunger for closure, or something more dangerous, for continuation. On the 13th day, I tried the key on room 6. It didn't fit. But something made me try room 5. The door opened. Inside, empty. Except for a note on the dresser, folded with precision, and a single glove. My glove. From the night at the library. The note read, "Some rooms aren't numbered in order. Some nights, neither are we." No signature, but it was him. He was close, watching, or had been. Was this a game, or a confession? I wasn't sure, but I knew then. I wanted to be found, truly found, not by a sketch, not by a memory, but by the weight of him, real and warm and uncertain. And so I wrote again, not on paper, on skin. That night, I stood in front of my mirror, and on my inner thigh, with the same ink he had used, I wrote, "Room 3, tonight." I left the door unlocked. I lit 1 candle, and I waited, wearing only the coat, buttoned once at the waist. Every hour passed like a slow waltz with no music. At midnight, I heard it. Not a knock, just the faintest sound of fabric brushing wood. He was there, not inside, not yet, but close enough to breathe me in. I turned toward the door, heart thudding. Then, footsteps, soft, nearer. Then, silence again. He didn't enter, but he had seen the ink, and maybe, for tonight, that was all I wanted, to be seen, to be read, to be known as a story not yet closed. The next morning, the ink on my skin had faded. Only a pale whisper remained where I had written room 3, tonight. A shadow of a message, like the memory of a breath that once warmed the space between two lips that didn't kiss. I wore the coat still. Each morning, I folded it neatly and placed it at the end of the bed, like an offering to something I could no longer name. Each night, I slipped back into it, closing one button, only one, and sat by the window with a book I never read. But he didn't come again. The sketch he had left remained on my desk, now protected behind glass. I caught myself staring at it far too often, not because it resembled me, but because it seemed to resemble the woman I was only in his presence. That version of myself, undone, unhidden, unhurried, existed nowhere else. On the 16th night, I visited room 6. The door was still locked. I leaned against it and whispered nothing, not a plea, not a name, just silence. And I think that was the first time I understood that wanting someone isn't the same as needing them to stay. Weeks passed, the cold faded, and Vienna returned to its lighter self. Tulips crept up through the iron fences near the canal. The cafes along the Ringstrasse began opening their windows, and the street musicians returned, playing slow waltzes that made even the pigeons pause. The overcoat, however, remained where I kept it, folded, sacred, still holding the faintest scent of him in the collar lining. And then, one morning, just before spring's first true rain, Frau Welten tapped lightly on my door. "You have a visitor," she said, eyes sparkling with something unreadable. I didn't move at first. I asked nothing. And then, "Where is he?" She pointed toward the courtyard. I stepped out slowly, heart thrumming so softly it almost hurt. Down the stairs, past the oak banister, and through the arched stone door into the garden where the violets were in bloom again. He stood there, hands in his pockets, a book under one arm, and a look I recognized. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't longing. It was something far more dangerous, the willingness to be vulnerable again. "I never stopped thinking about the coat," he said. Neither of us moved closer. "I never stopped wearing it," I replied. A long breath passed between us. The air felt golden, like the hour before dusk, when everything softens. "I couldn't stay that night," he confessed. "I wanted to, but I needed to know if what I felt was real, or just the echo of a moment." "And?" I asked. He stepped forward. "It was real." I didn't answer. Instead, I turned and walked back upstairs. Left the door to room 3 open behind me. A minute passed, then 2. And then I heard the floorboards. He entered without speaking. I stood by the mirror. The robe was still tied at the waist. I held the coat in my hands, pressing it once more to my chest. then offering it to him into him. Would you help me into it? His hands touched my shoulders with the reverence of a prayer. He slid the coat over my arm slowly, drawing the collar close beneath my neck. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, I met his gaze in the mirror. He undid the single button at my waist and waited. I thought we weren't touching, he said again, repeating that line from our first night. I'm not silk anymore, I whispered. I'm skin. I'm memory. I'm ready to be unwrapped. He stepped behind me. No haste, no hunger, just the quiet joy of returning to something unfinished. The coat slid off me in silence. He kissed the place just beneath my shoulder blade, where the ink had been. Then my spine, then lower, until my breath was no longer mine alone. What we shared wasn't about urgency, it was about revelation, not in what was taken off, but in what was seen beneath it. Later, he lay beside me, tracing the inside of my arm with the back of his fingers. The candles had long since burned low. The snow was gone now, replaced by rain whispering down the windows like a memory trying to return. He said, "You were always more than I could sketch, and you were more than I ever thought would stay." He kissed the hollow of my collarbone, where the coat had once rested. "Are you staying?" I asked, eyes closed. He didn't answer, but neither did he leave. That night, we fell asleep with the coat beneath us, spread like a map across the bed. No longer a barrier, no longer a question, just a reminder that sometimes the most intimate thing you can wear is someone's presence. There is a kind of silence that falls over an apartment just before a memory walks back into it. Mine was a small place in the Quartier Latin, perched above a bookstore that smelled of old ink and forgotten philosophies. The wallpaper had started to curl in the corners, and the radiator clanked like an old man clearing his throat. But it was home, a place where I once imagined her laugh, lingering in the stairwell, and her scent, like worn lavender in dusk, folded into the sheets. It had been almost a year since she left Paris, or rather, since she left me in Paris. We had said it was temporary, a teaching position in Marseille, something that sounded innocent. But the silence in her letters grew louder with each passing month, and then they stopped. So, when I heard the familiar knock, two soft, one sharp, my body moved before my thoughts did. I opened the door, and there she was, Claire. Same tousled hair, now tucked beneath a knit beret. Same deep-set eyes, tired in the way that comes from chasing things we once thought we wanted. And in her arms, not a suitcase, not a lover's token, but a weathered, leather-bound journal, bound in the same ribbon I had once tied around her wrist in Florence after our first night together. "May I come in?" she asked softly. I should have said something clever, or at least bitter, but instead, I stepped aside. She walked in slowly, eyes scanning the room like it had aged without her, and in many ways, it had. This place still smells like burnt coffee, she murmured, placing the journal gently on the edge of my bed. You used to like that, I said, surprising even myself with the way my voice cracked. She looked at me then, really looked, with that expression of hers that seemed to peel back all the distance between us in one blink. I still do. She sat on the edge of the mattress, legs crossed, fingers trailing over the spine of the journal. I read it, she said, all of it, last night. There was no need to ask what it was. Her diary, the one she'd kept during those months when we didn't speak, the one she had once forbidden me to open. And now she held it like a fragile confession, pages filled with the words she couldn't say when we were face to face. Why did you come back? I asked finally. She didn't answer right away. She looked down, undid the ribbon, and opened to a page near the middle. Her voice was quieter than I remembered, slower, breathier, as though she wasn't sure she had the right to be speaking here anymore. October 13th, I wore the white slip he liked under my sweater. I pretended I didn't know he could see it through the fabric. I wanted him to ask. He didn't. But when he leaned in to light my cigarette, his fingers brushed my thigh. I remember how his hand trembled and how mine didn't. My chest tightened. I remembered that day. A bookshop in Montmartre. The air heavy with rain and tension. I had stared at the outline beneath her clothes for an hour, unable to say a word. You wrote about that? She nodded, not looking up. I wrote about everything. And then, without asking, she kept reading. November 2nd. I told myself I was happy in Marseille, but I woke up from a dream last night where he was reading aloud to me in bed. He kept stopping in the middle of sentences just to kiss the back of my knee. I cried when I woke up. The images came back too vividly. Her knees tucked against me under the blankets, my voice raspy from the book, from the wine, from her. I sat down beside her. Not close, not yet, but enough to feel the warmth from her body as she turned another page. She didn't ask for permission. She just kept reading, and every word felt like a layer of her clothing being undone, not from her body, but from the barricade she had wrapped around the year we lost. December 19th. If I see him again, I think I'll ask him to undress me with his voice, not his hands. I want to know what it sounds like when a man touches you with words. Her voice wavered on that line, just slightly. She looked up, finally, her lips parting with something between apology and challenge. I never sent these to you, she said, because I wasn't brave enough to be read. I would have read every word, I whispered. I know. That's what scared me. Silence bloomed between us. Not awkward, not empty, just full. Like an unspoken understanding that we had built something sacred in this room, and maybe, just maybe, it hadn't been broken beyond repair. Do you want to hear more? She asked, fingers hovering above another page. I should have said no. I should have asked her to leave. but I found myself nodding, and then, without ceremony, she leaned back on the pillows, bare feet curling against the duvet like they belonged there. She pulled her knees up slightly, the hem of her dress riding just enough to show the smooth line of her thigh, and she began to read again. The next evening, she returned just before dusk, this time wearing a loose linen blouse, tucked half-heartedly into high-waisted trousers. The light in my room was dim, honeyed by the fading sun that filtered through the lace curtains. She didn't knock. She never did. Simply eased the door open and walked in barefoot, holding the diary close to her chest. Her presence filled the room the way a song does, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Her scent, that same lavender and old paper, mingled with the air thick with July heat and the distant toll of cathedral bells. She smiled, not at me, but at the chair, the book, the moment. I marked a few entries, she said, settling cross-legged on the bed without invitation. Nothing dramatic, just days I didn't want to forget. And again, she read. This time, her voice was less performative, more intimate, slower. It was as if the act of reading to me had shifted from confession to communion. The entry was from last winter, a Sunday in Paris. She had sat at a cafe, watching strangers from behind a fogged-up window, writing about the way a man had kissed his wife's fingertips before leaving. I remember, she paused, wishing someone would look at me that way, like I was already the memory they'd miss tomorrow. I didn't know what to say, so I poured us both wine, red, aged, the kind that clung to the glass, and we sat in silence for a moment that felt like it had weight, like it might bruise if we moved too quickly. When she opened the book again, something shifted. Her thumb held the place for a moment, hesitating. Then, with a breath she didn't mean to release so audibly, she began reading. March 3rd. I shouldn't write this down. But his hands, how slow they are, how unafraid. He touched the back of my knee as though memorizing a language. I remember the linen sticking to my spine. I remember not wanting the morning to arrive. She froze. Her eyes widened just slightly, realizing what she'd just read aloud. There was a flush in her neck now, subtle but unmistakable. I didn't mean to, she began, but I held up a hand gently. Don't apologize for remembering something beautiful. We didn't speak for a long while. Outside, someone played a slow jazz piece on a muted trumpet. The city was full of sounds, but they felt miles away from us now. She leaned back on the bed, resting her head against the wooden headboard, eyes closed. The diary lay open on her lap like an invitation half offered. Do you ever worry, she whispered, that if you say a memory aloud, it loses something? Sometimes, I said, but sometimes it becomes something more. Her eyes met mine, and then, without planning it, without permission or pretense, she reached across the bed and took my hand. Her fingers were cold. Mine were not. The sun had set by then, and all that remained was lamplight and the softness of sheets. She didn't read any more that night. Instead, she lay down beside me, on top of the covers, still holding the book, still not letting go of my hand. We talked about cities we'd loved and meals we'd forgotten. She told me about a hotel room in Lisbon where she danced barefoot to a song she never learned the name of. I told her about the day I left home and how it felt like tearing the first page out of a favorite book. "Do you think," she asked, her voice thin with exhaustion, "some stories were never meant to be shared?" I thought of her diary, of the way her voice trembled on that passage. "I think the best ones are," I said. She didn't respond, not in words, but her eyes softened, her body tilted ever so slightly toward mine. And in that moment, it was as if we weren't just two people in a rented room with a book between us. We were something slower, quieter, a story still being written, with no hurry to end. By the time the third evening came, the diary no longer felt like a book. It felt like a third body in the room. She returned later than usual, nearly midnight, wrapped in a long navy coat far too large for her, sleeves past her knuckles, collar upturned against the wind. Her hair, slightly damp, curled around her cheeks in disobedient wisps. I had left the lamp on for her. She stepped inside without knocking, again. This time, she didn't speak at first, just undid her coat, revealing the silk slip beneath, the same pale one she had once described in an old entry, the dress I wear only when I want to feel remembered. I didn't ask why she came that way. I didn't need to. She walked across the room like the night belonged to her. The diary, which still lay half open on the table, had been left untouched since her last visit. "I think I skipped a few pages," she said softly, almost to herself. "Not on purpose, just maybe I wasn't ready." I watched her pick it up again. She stood with her back to the lamp, reading silently now. Her shadow stretched across the floorboards. The room was so quiet, I could hear the turn of each page. After a long silence, she looked up. "There's one I never thought I'd read aloud," she said, eyes searching mine, "because it wasn't written to be heard." I said nothing. I waited. She sat on the bed, this time closer. Her knee touched mine. Her voice was steady, but soft enough that I had to lean in. "There was a moment, the night he stayed, not the first time, but the first time it felt like more, where I turned my back to him, not out of shame, but offering. I remember how he pulled my hair aside, how his hand didn't rush, how silence filled the room like warm water. We didn't speak, not because there was nothing to say, but because words would have broken what was happening." She stopped reading, and slowly she closed the diary. There was something charged in the room now, not just memory, but presence. Her skin glowed in the lamplight, her breath slower, heavier. She placed the diary gently on the bedside table, as if setting down a memory that had served its purpose. And then she turned toward me. "This part," she whispered, was never meant to be read. It was meant to be felt. No kiss followed, no rush, just the tension of nearness, her knee still pressing against mine, her shoulder brushing my arm, the space between us electric. She didn't undress, not further. She didn't need to. The intimacy wasn't in exposure, it was in permission. I reached for her hand. She let me. She leaned her head on my shoulder. I rested my cheek atop her hair. The scent of ink and lavender was still there, and something else now. The faintest trace of her skin warmed by wool and silk and candlelight. There, in that room with the windows fogging from our breath, we said nothing. The story had paused, not ended. Eventually, she broke the silence. "Do you think," she murmured, "you'll write about this someday?" "Only if you want me to," I said. "I want you to remember," she replied. "That's all." Later, much later, she fell asleep curled beside me, the diary pressed to her chest, like armor and confession in one. Her breathing was slow, dreamless. And I, for the first time in many years, did not want to fall asleep. I wanted to stay awake and memorize how the air moved when she exhaled. I wanted to remember the weight of her closeness, not heavy, but permanent. I watched the flicker of the streetlight outside bend across her bare shoulder. The room was nearly dark, but not quite. A quiet hung between us that no longer needed narration. And as dawn touched the edge of the curtains, I realized something. There were stories she would never read aloud, but they were there, in the spaces between her breaths, in the way her fingers had curled into my sleeve, in the silent gift of her stillness. She had let me listen to what no one else had heard, and that, more than any written word, was the intimacy she trusted me with. She didn't return for 3 nights. In that time, the room changed. Or maybe it hadn't, but now I noticed its emptiness more acutely. The way her mug remained untouched, the faint scent of lavender still clinging to the pillow she'd once borrowed, and the diary, lying closed on the nightstand, its leather cover curled slightly at the corners, like an unopened letter. I didn't open it. I didn't dare. On the 4th night, just as I was beginning to believe she'd left for good, vanished like a page torn out too soon, she came back. Not in silence this time, but with a knock. She stood there, framed in the doorway, her eyes different, not sad, not distant, but resolved. She wore a simple black dress that fit like punctuation, quiet, final. In her hands, she held the diary, not tucked to her chest, but lowered by her side. "I won't stay long," she said, stepping inside. I rose from the bed, unsure whether to move toward her or let her words find their shape first. She walked slowly, her steps measured, as if each one pulled her further from something she hadn't named yet. She sat, not on the bed this time, but in the chair by the window, the same chair she once refused, saying it made her feel too far away. "I came to leave something behind," she said, placing the diary on the table next to the lamp we had forgotten to turn off for days. And to read one last thing. My chest tightened. "I thought you'd finished," I said. She shook her head. "There's one page I never dared read, not even alone." The air changed. The room seemed to hold its breath. She opened the book. Not carefully, not afraid, but deliberately. She flipped past bookmarks, dog-eared corners, old smudges of ink and wine, until finally she landed on the page. It had no date, no preamble, just a few sentences, handwritten hastily in darker ink, the loops of her letters smaller, tighter. She looked at me once, then began. "If he ever asks, if he ever really wants to know, tell him this. I came to the room for stories, yes, but I stayed because of the way he listened, not just to my words, but to what I didn't say. I let him hear me without shame, and in his quiet, I found the part of me I'd stopped writing about." Her voice broke there. She didn't apologize. Instead, she closed the book slowly, as if laying to rest something that had been trembling too long. I knelt beside the chair. She reached out and rested her hand on the back of my neck, her thumb brushing gently behind my ear, a gesture too tender for goodbye, too practiced to be accidental. "I'm leaving in the morning," she whispered. I looked up. "Why?" She smiled, and for the first time since I met her, I saw all the years in her eyes. Because stories need an ending. I wanted to argue, but what could I say? That I wasn't ready? That I wanted more pages? Instead, I whispered, "You could stay." "I already have," she replied, brushing my collar, her fingers lingering as if memorizing the weight of my presence. Longer than I meant to. Longer than I ever let anyone. She stood. The diary, now closed, sat between us like a candle whose flame had flickered out on its own, not extinguished, just complete. At the door, she paused. "Don't forget what you heard," she said. I nodded. She left. Weeks passed. The room faded back into its old rhythm, the hum of city sounds, the early light casting familiar shapes on the wooden floor. The chair remained by the window. Her mug was finally washed and returned to the cupboard, but the diary stayed on the nightstand. One evening, I opened it, not to reread her entries, but to add one of my own. The last page was blank. She left me silence, and in it, I've written her 1,000 times. Not with ink, not with words, but with the shape her absence makes. Sometimes, when the nights are quiet enough, I can still hear her voice, the rhythm of her breath, when she'd forget she was being listened to, the hush in her pauses when reading something almost too vulnerable. She didn't just share her diary with me, she gave me the unwritten part, and that I keep close. Not between pages, but in bed, where her story lingers, unread but never forgotten. If you're still awake, maybe it's not sleep you were looking for tonight. Maybe it was memory or closeness. or the kind of story that touches your skin without asking permission. We tied hair, we unbuttoned silence, we read what wasn't meant to be heard, and somewhere between silk, longing, and breath, you were seen. So rest now. Let the night finish what the story began. And if you dream of him or her, don't be surprised. Some stories don't end when the telling stops. Good night.